A very good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to our webinar on situational leadership in today's day and age. Ever changing scenarios, challenges with your team, and self improvement never cease to surprise us in this competitive atmosphere we are in today. As a result of this, different situations demand different styles of leadership. This webinar will help you identify your leadership styles and will guide you on how to develop new ones to manage different kinds of people and situations. Without much further ado, let me introduce our esteemed expert, Mr. Srinivas Nagappa. Srinivas is a renowned International Coaching Federation and Marshall Goldsmith certified coach and trainer. He has held several leadership and board positions over his 35 years in the industry. He has helped several executives to navigate leadership challenges through his effective coaching and training methods. Before we begin, I would like to remind you all that you can send in your questions using the questions section on the control panel to the right of your screen. We will take these questions up one by one post Srinivas's talk. Our best attempt would be to answer as many questions as possible. We hope that you enjoy the webinar and take home some key learning which you can implement immediately. I would now like to hand over to Srinivas.
Thank you very much, Shri, and welcome to everybody. My name is Srinivas Nagappa, and yes, a bit like how Shri said, I've done a few things over the last 35 years. I think it sounds better on paper. Some of those were, I think, pretty hard to do, and I think we all learn both through our successes and through our failures. We're talking a little bit today about leadership and how it is relevant to all of us. I think there is no shortage of leadership material in the net at large, and all of you must have had at some point a chance to delve into it. We'll pick up a small microcosm of that and talk about a few of the aspects as they apply back to us. So what we're going to cover over the next roughly an hour, because thanks to all of you and thanks to Shrey, we've started pretty much on schedule. We will, over about 30 to 40 minutes, cover the first 4 items on the slide that you see. We're going to talk a little bit about who a leader is. We will, of course, address the situational leadership part and an overview of that, because that's primarily what you're here for. We'll talk about it not just from a theoretical construct, but also in terms of how you can apply it back to your everyday life. We'll touch upon the whole area of how do I know what sort of leader I am, what's my preferred style, is it good, is it bad, do I need to do something about it? That's something that we'll touch upon. And hopefully over the last few minutes, maybe 20, maybe 25 minutes, we'll find some time to answer as many of your questions as possible. So that's basically how we would look to spend the next hour that we are together. Let me then move on in terms of what is leadership before I come to the whole situational leadership part. I think it's a traditional notion which is not very valid anymore, that to be a leader, I need to have all those things and maybe many more that are on the slide. Meaning that I probably need to be a CEO, I need to be a president, an EVP, a unit head, whatever it is. I need to have a large, high title, a high position, a large office. I need a large team that reports to me. Maybe it's better if they report from across the globe, but at least a large team in 1 or 2 locations. That I need to be responsible for large budgets, and that in some way or the other I need to have a responsibility not just for the top line but also for the middle line, which is and of course the bottom line. So that's a notion that I think sometimes many of us have, and that's something which I think in today's day and age is not at all valid. I'm not very sure whether it was valid 30 years ago or not, probably not, but certainly not in today's day and age. So if that's really a wrong notion of what to be a leader means, what, as I view it, is a right notion. And you must appreciate these are my thoughts. my thoughts as both a practitioner as well as somebody who teaches. But at the same time, you don't necessarily have to believe it's 100% right. You're free to have a slightly different version. Here is what I believe leadership today and leaders today are defined by. So a leader is basically one who takes responsibility for people, for events, for situations. He takes responsibility for getting things done. He or she drives results. Because at the end of the day, as you're all aware, even if I have the greatest of thoughts, if I don't put it into action, it doesn't benefit anybody, including myself. If an organization has the best of strategy but does nothing about it, except create more and more documents, the organization does not benefit. Both ourselves as well as the organization, we both benefit when we are able to get action going. And when action goes, when action happens, then essentially, we are looking at creating results. Yeah, so that's essentially why a leader is one who drives results. The next point is an interesting part of influencing people. Most of us, I think, are brought up to believe that the only influencing that happens is top down, which means that there is a leader who has a hierarchy over me, which means that he has one or two or three more stripes on his shoulder and is therefore more senior to him. I report to him, and therefore he has a chance to influence me. But take a moment to reflect on the fact. I think some of you are probably part of a matrix organization. Now, privately and in your personal time, you might actually tell your spouse and your friends and your colleagues about what a terrible thing a matrix organization is. But in reality, a matrix organization has tremendous strengths which are waiting to be leveraged. And in a matrix organization, very often, the people who you have dotted line relationships to may or may not actually be people who are directly in your hierarchy, and yet it's important for them to be able to influence you. Similarly, it's important for you to be able to influence them. And that's why I say a true leader does not need to have a very high position in the hierarchy. He is still somebody who, if he is able to influence people, persuade people, carry people along, then in reality he is a leader, she is a leader. The fourth point there is an interesting one about developing both self and others. Developing oneself in terms of what we actually are capable of, and therefore, from that perspective, in terms of learning more and therefore doing more. And then, importantly, in terms of ensuring that along this journey of learning, we carry other people along and improve their abilities. I'll come back probably a little later to a statement, but I'll just introduce it at this point. There is a very influential author called Dan Pink. He's also a Harvard professor. He's written a number of books, etc., etc. And Dan Pink essentially says that people will work for you and your organization when you are able to develop in them three things. The first is mastery in their work. The second is a self of purpose. And third is a level of autonomy that they have in terms of being able to chart their own course and work at their own pace. So mastery, autonomy, and a sense of purpose. And I'll come back to this in a little while. But essentially where it applies here is that as you develop capability in others, you're helping them along the journey of mastery. And to that extent, they will certainly appreciate your contributions, and in that way, you will be a leader. Look at also the fact that in all our businesses, in all your businesses, change is happening every day. I guess change has always happened, but now I think the pace of change is probably something which is a little faster. And when you look at it from that perspective, a leader is also one who is able to think ahead. Thought leadership is a phrase you must have come across, and that is something which is very big. So even if you don't have anybody reporting to you, if you are able to get on top of your job, if you are able to develop processes and systems, if you are able to work on something that lasts beyond your immediate contribution, then you are a leader. Now reflect on these 5 bits. And the real question is, do you do some or all of this? And the answer is probably yes. The answer is probably yes. You do some or all or many of this. And in that sense, you really qualify as a leader. And let's assume there might be one or two of you, or maybe some of us, who feel that, in many of these areas, nothing is being done by me. It's something worth reflecting in terms of, can I actually get into any of these areas and thereby establish myself as a leader? Let's then move into what the topic for today, which we started with, which is situational leadership, is all about. I think many of you will be interested, maybe some of you will be aghast to know that it's almost 50 years old. It's almost 50 years old. And those two gentlemen, Ken Blanchard and Paul Hersey, authored it. They then revised it multiple times. They added to it. They made it stronger. Very interestingly, it's as relevant today as it was way back when it was first picked up and talked about or created. And that's some of the things that we will address over the next few minutes. So the definition of a situational leader is A, that a leader needs to adapt his or her style to different situations. One of the areas they need to adapt is with regard to the teams that they are working with. The characteristics of others in the team is a basis for the leader adapting his or her style. And what are the characteristics that typically are looked at in this model? They are looking at both the capability, which is measured as competence, as well as the attitude, which is measured as commitment. So a leader essentially adapts to a number of different situations, and one of the dimensions of adapting is with regard to the characteristics, the capability, the commitment of the team members they are working with. Again, just to clarify, when I say team members, I don't necessarily only mean people who are one stripe or two stripes or one level or two levels below you. They could be anybody that you're working with. Maybe you're part of a cross-functional team where the others are also peers, but pretty much the same thoughts, pretty much the same ideas can actually apply back to that situation also. So let's pick up the competence and the commitment aspects and dwell a little more, since they are very fundamental to situational leadership. Essentially, if you look at the two axes before getting into the contribution or what the boxes are filled with, there's competence on the x-axis, and the left side of the axis is a low competence, and the right side is a high competence. The y-axis is about commitment, and again on the lower side it is low, and as you climb the ladder of commitment, it obviously becomes high. Right? Let me just take a moment and define what I mean by both of these. Competence is essentially how good the team member is at the task that he or she is tasked with, right? So what is their capability? What are the skill levels that they have in them to be able to successfully carry out the task? And that could be high or that could be low, and that's the x-axis of competence. The y-axis of competent is all about their attitude, right? So as they have a better attitude, they are seen as having a higher level of commitment. Yeah, fairly straightforward, fairly simple. Now, let's look at some of the characteristics in each of these four boxes. So to start with, somebody in the low box, right? So low on commitment, low on competence. How is that person going to come across to you? Because remember, all these adjectives that we have there are about team members, right? So if a team member comes across to you as being bored or demotivated, or really always saying, I have no idea how this is supposed to be done, or saying that, I've really tried very hard but nothing seems to be working, they're probably low on commitment and low on competence. As the competence increases, even if the commitment does not, you will find that they are becoming more capable, they are able to contribute to situations, but because the commitment is low, they continue to be a little insecure, therefore they are cautious, therefore they will speak only when asked, etc., etc. Look at the top left-hand box, which is low on competence and high on commitment. These are typically people who are not very skilled, not very experienced, but they've come in and they're full of enthusiasm, they're full of eagerness. But the fact of the matter is they don't quite know how to get things done. And therefore, over a period of time, if they continue in that box, i.e. that their competence continues to be low, then over a period of time they will slip down to the bottom left box, because you can be curious, you can be eager for a period of time, but if you don't have any achievements against your name, you don't feel you're getting things done, etc., etc., you are unlikely to remain eager and curious. You're probably likely to get demotivated, etc. And the top box on the right is all about somebody who is competent as well as committed. And this person is, let's say, like an ideal team worker, an ideal boss, an ideal employee. They are self-starters. They get things done because of their high initiative. They inspire both themselves and their others. And they come across as confident because they are very sure about their capabilities. Yeah. So this is the commitment competence characteristic, which is fundamental to understanding the Ken Blanchard and Hersey model of situational leadership. Let me now move on in terms of giving you an idea of how this combines with a situational leadership measurement. So situational leadership looks at leaders as having a combination of a task orientation and a relationship orientation. What are these two things? A task oriented, or I am task oriented as a leader when my focus is get the thing done on time with the right quality. In the process, I might bruise egos, I might not carry people along, I might have a set of people who keep coming and going, but my whole focus is not that. I am all about getting the task done. Typically what happens when I'm completely task oriented is I deliver results, but I deliver results in the short term, because in the longer term what happens is my team burns out, my team gets demotivated, and slowly we find that results begin to slip. A relationship orientation, on the other hand, is where a leader is focused primarily on his or her people. So the people love the leader, he thinks very well of them, he or she looks after them in a great way, but the results are not given the sort of focus they need to. And typically then what happens is, after 1 or 2 quarters, this sort of a leader gets called into his boss's office, and the boss says, everybody is very happy with you except me, because what's happening is you're not delivering your commitments. You're not delivering for what you were hired. You're not delivering the business side of it. And obviously, as you can see, neither having 100% task orientation nor having 100% relationship orientation is necessarily the answer. And sometimes people will say, oh, he's task oriented, it's very good in the short term. Somebody will say he or she is very relationship orientation, good, but again in the short term, and you need the and of both of these, not the or. So as leaders, it's not that you can be either task oriented or relationship oriented. You have to be both, and you have to have a balance of both. And that's fundamental to an understanding of what situational leadership is about. So if I extrapolate what I just said, and I put again on a 2x2 task behavior along the x-axis in that little chart that you can see, task behavior is also known as being directive. Directive means I am giving instructions, I am giving directions. Okay, so whether I am a low task behavior person or a high task behavior person for that situation can be mapped. Similarly, how good am I on the relationship side? How supportive is my behavior? Again, can be mapped as low and high. Right? So essentially, two axes: task behavior and relationship behavior. Right? Now, the way situation leadership gives all of these four boxes some phrases, some labels, are as follows. So when task behavior is high, I as a leader am highly directive, right? Just to clarify, because sometimes there is a little bit of a confusion, now I'm talking about my style as a leader. The earlier chart that you saw was about the characteristics of my team workers. So just for the sake of argument, just so that we can keep it clear, this bit that I showed you, I've just moved back 2 slides, was about the characteristics that team members display depending on how competent and how committed they are. I'll weave this in, but for the moment, just park this and then come back to where I'm looking at now, which is to say that my behavior as a leader, if I am highly directive, so I am on the right hand side of that 2 by 2 matrix, and I am low on the relationship behavior in terms of low support for a particular individual, I am in the telling mode, telling as in giving instructions mode. Similarly, I could say that if I'm high on directive and high on relationship supportive, I could be coaching somebody. That's the phrase that the situational leadership model gives to this particular box. Coaching is defined, I think, very differently in terms of pure coaching, but we will stay with the phrase that the originators of situational leadership came up with, and therefore this box of high directive and high supportive is called coaching. The box in the 2 by 2 which has low directive and high supportive is called participating. And if I look at the fourth box, which has low directive and low supportive, it's got delegating. It's called delegating. It's important for us to understand that there are no value judgments assigned to any of these 4 boxes. Otherwise, as leaders, as human beings, we are used to the fact that anything which is low, low, we will say, oh, this is a terrible state of affairs, right? But this is not the case here. So there is no value judgment assigned to any of these 4 boxes. You will be adopting the style of any of these 4 boxes depending on the characteristics of your team members. And there's nothing wrong if with some team members you feel the need to tell. There's nothing wrong if with some team members you feel the need that you can delegate. With a few, maybe you are in participative or a facilitating mode, and with a few you may be in a coaching mode, because at that point in time they need a level of direction as well as support. So be very clear that there is absolutely no value judgment assigned to each of these 4. In fact, the good leaders will, depending on the team member they are working with, alternate between all of these 4 or many of these 4 styles, because that is the need to get the job done. So let me now, each of these 4 boxes in turn, take a minute or so and talk about what is there in each of these 4 boxes. So let's start with the telling bit, which is high directive, low supportive. So when you as a leader are in a high directive, low supportive style, which means that you are in a telling or instructional style, essentially it's because the team members' skill and commitment are both low. Okay, and because the person doesn't have too much of knowledge of the job, as well as, let us say, is not quite committed, probably because of a low level of competence, you are basically telling them what to do. And in this case, while of course you will be supportive to some extent, when I say low, I do not at any stage mean 0. I mean that it's not a very large part of this style, but it's certainly not anywhere near 0. Okay, so when you are working in this mode with a certain team members whose skill and commitment is both low, your primary focus is, let me improve his or her mastery. We spoke of mastery as Dan Pink talks about it a little earlier, and essentially your focus is, you give a little more instructions, you teach them what to do, you teach them how to do it, right? So that's essentially what style you are adopting when you as a leader are in the telling mode. You are much more directive than you are supportive. Let's look at the box immediately above the telling. There you will see, and that's highlighted in the dark color, but I've just kept it as a progressive so you can actually see the difference between the boxes. So what we talked in the previous slide about the telling is now a little smaller, but the point that I'm going to make now about coaching, and therefore that's a little larger. Essentially, coaching is when the competence is improving, it's getting better. It's still on the lowish side, it's not the greatest, but it's, let's say, low to moderate. The commitment is now got high because the employee also, the team member also sees a level of quality of their own capability and expertise growing. And what you're doing in this coaching mode is that you're listening to them, you're explaining things to them, you're guiding them, right? And once again, the focus in this case is in terms of improving their competence. Therefore, you are a little more directive. At the same time, you're now beginning to realize that they're getting to a stage when they will probably, over a period of time, be moving to the next stage and becoming more self-reliant, and therefore you're helping them with that transition, and therefore it's the whole area of being supportive. Let me move now to the participating bit, right? And the participating bit essentially means that you are dealing with a team member who is competent. The commitment, well, is there sometimes, but not all of the times, and you have a few questions about the commitment. So essentially, what are you trying to do with this person? You're trying to essentially make this person feel a little more important and get this person to contribute a little more to the cause, to the company, to the team, to the organization, etc. And therefore, what you will do is you will listen a little more to them, you will appreciate their good ideas, you will co-create along with them, and essentially you would look to say, hey, I would like you to get more and more independent. I would like you to be more and more self-reliant, right? So that is something which typically as a leader you will employ with somebody who is competent, and the commitment, well, is reasonable. And then moving on to the fourth stage of delegation. Essentially, the employee here, the team member here, the co-worker here is capable as well as committed. And therefore, what are you doing here? You are essentially showing as a leader your trust in them, you are empowering them, you are acknowledging their good work, and at the same time, you are continually challenging. Now, people sometimes ask, hey, this delegating is about low and low, so is it a bad thing? Like I said earlier, there is no value judgment attached to any of these boxes. So you are less directive, you are low directive in the sense you're not telling the person who is in the low box, which means the person you will delegate to, you're not telling them on an ongoing basis that this needs to be done, you're not micromanaging. At the same time, they don't have a very big need for constant reassurance from you because they have faith, they have trust in their own capabilities, right? And therefore, the amount of time you spend with them in terms of supporting them is on the lower side. It's not that you would never meet, it's not that you would be completely ignoring them, it's not that if they have a problem you will say go find your own answer. Certainly not any of that, right? But just to highlight the differences between the four styles that we sometimes have to adopt with our co-workers, this is, the point has been made a little strongly to just bring out the differences. Okay, so essentially when you look at it, and this slide that I have up now brings together what was talked about differently, what was talked about individually for each of the four boxes, and that's essentially a summary box. So you have a telling box where you are high directive and you are low supportive. You have a coaching box where you are still high on the directive, but you have certainly built up a little bit more on your supportive side. You have a participating box where the person is competent, it's the commitment that probably needs addressing, and what you're doing is you are probably less directive, but you're still largely supportive. And then you get to a delegating box where your directive behavior is low, but at the same time the person doesn't require a very much of time in terms of relationship building and support. So typically now, if you actually look at this, we usually think that the bottom left box is probably the weakest or the lowest. But if you look at it from this perspective, and for this particular 2x2 matrix, the delegating is really where you would like all of your team members to be. And why? Simply because when you have team members and co-workers who are capable of having tasks delegated to them, it frees you up to do something bigger, to develop your own capabilities and to shine. Let me take a moment also and talk about delegation in terms of how we often view it. If you ask many of our leaders, how much do you delegate, or you pick up a particular person and say, do you delegate to this person? They'll probably say, no, he or she is not quite capable, or they'll say he or she takes too long to do it, and therefore I find it far easier to do it myself. And probably that resonates, right? All of us must have used that excuse at some point or the other. But if you actually look at it carefully, what's really happening what's really happening is that in many cases it is our level of insecurity which is preventing us from delegating. People are actually saying, oh, what happens if my boss finds out that somebody else is doing my job? Will I then be completely irrelevant? Will I then be sidelined? And the answer is no. We have to get over that insecurity. We often say we are too busy to spend the 2 hours or the 3 hours to actually help somebody else, but that doesn't make sense, because if we spend that 3 hours today to help them to learn the skills, we save multiple 3 hours. And essentially, your role as a leader is in terms of sustainable good results. And from that perspective, you have to keep moving your team members from your being highly directive to a state when they have sufficient mastery. You can give them more and more autonomy, which means you don't have to micromanage them. And of course, they are committed because they have a sense of purpose, which means that you are able to delegate more and more to them. Right? So that's essentially where you have to get to with all of this. Maybe, Shrey, if it is okay with you, let me stop for a minute and just check, not only in terms of questions, but more in terms of does anybody need any clarifications in terms of anything that I've said? If it's likely to be a question or so on, I'll probably take it later. Shrey, do you think it's a good idea to stop and ask for a moment?
Yeah, so there was one clarification that had come.
Yeah.
The person is asking whether you're sure about competent being high in the participating quadrant.
Meaning, how can you be sure?
Yeah,
Is that the question?
yeah, I think so. Yes.
Okay. So if the question is, how can you be sure of competence being high in the participating quadrant? Well, the competence is probably something which is easier to see and measure than an attitude. So a competent person typically is very good at his or her work. So you know from the fact that they complete whatever they are supposed to do, of course within the agreed time frame and at a good quality of work. So competence is something which is actually fairly easily measured. And if you have a doubt about it, for example, it's actually a good idea, if you especially think that that person is in the participating category, then you can actually use a little bit of the technique of asking them why they did this, how they did this, not in a questioning manner which is meant to make them defensive, but more with a view to saying, hey, let me understand, how is it that this came about, how is it that you took this decision, why is it that you really picked this way of doing it. And I think when you have that discussion with them, you'll get a pretty good sense fairly quickly in terms of level of competence, right? And that is something which typically is something which is pretty necessary. And again, uh, will you actually have people very squarely in the middle of each of these boxes? The answer is clearly no. But then, to be able to depict every person that we come across as a leader would probably need a spreadsheet or a PPT which had 600 rows across and 6,000 columns. So from that perspective, both of us would find it difficult to take something away from it. So this has been slightly simplified, but the meaning behind it is still very clear. And the whole idea, when you are looking to co-create with somebody in the participating phase, because co-creation is a big part of it, you must be very sure that that person is competent. Because if that person is not competent, given that you are spending less time in terms of directing them, you could have a bad result. Could I move on, Shrey?
The
Shall I move on?
participant who had asked that question also
Yes.
has given some clarification. She's
Yes.
asking if the relationship between the team capability is being mapped with this slide, then how does competence show as high here? That is the question, is what she said. And is
Okay,
there a
so
correlation?
let me just quickly clarify that part. Sorry, sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah.
Shay, but let me just quickly clarify that part. This is how do I, as a leader, come across with individual members in my team. This is not team competence of competent or team commitment. So let us assume I have six people working for me: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, E, F. Sorry. This is essentially, I will say, where does A fit in on this? Does A have high competence? Does A have high commitment? Or yes, no, etc., etc. Right? And then I adapt and adopt a style towards team member A. Then I similarly look at it for team member B, similarly for C, similarly for D. So as a leader, I am not going to have one style towards all the six people in my team. Let me pause there and let's pick up if there is an additional clarification or question. Shrey?
She's asking if there is a correlation between the slide on team capability and the commitment with this slide or not, which I think you have answered.
Yeah, sure. There is a correlation in terms of the characteristics that you will typically get. So if somebody is, let us say, competent is high, and let us say the commitment is slightly variable. I'm going back to this slide. Put it back once again. So you have a slightly lowish competence. I'm sorry, a lowish commitment. Sorry, low competence. I think that was the question. Yeah, but a high commitment. Then essentially, while you will see the person as being capable, the person will display some of the other attributes. And remember again, this is not team as a whole. This is individual person that you're working with. Yeah, Shay. So shall I go back to where I was and continue, and then we'll pick up the
Yeah,
questions at
yeah.
the end?
Just another
Okay,
thought, sir. If you can share examples on each of these types, that will be great.
sure. I will come back and touch upon that in a moment. Okay. So the question that comes back, and again, do understand, please, that we are looking at fitting zillions of people into four boxes. Never very easy, but I think this would work probably 95% of the time. When do you do what? So again, back to the question that just came on the chat box, which Shrey just talked about some examples. Let's assume I have somebody who is very new in the company, right? Very new in the company, very new in the function. They've just joined the company. They probably joined reasonably eagerly, but after a couple of days, all of us face this at all times. We wonder, gosh, where have I come, right? So typically, that sort of a person who is fairly young in the organization needs a fair amount of telling. So you, as a leader, will adopt the style of saying that there's a fair amount of Can you hear me? I think the audio was lost briefly.
Yeah, it got cut off in the middle, sir. You can continue now. It's audible.
It's now audible. All right. Okay. So, like I was saying, the telling part would be typically with somebody who is new, somebody who is new to your organization, probably new to the function, and is still learning and therefore getting there as we go along. Typically, the coaching part, where the competence is somewhat low, but the commitment is high. Now, again, I don't want to necessarily get into generalities on all of this, but typically, let us say you might have some employees who've been in a different type of a structure, and over a period of time, let us say there was a migration that happened to something else, and what has happened is that they find that some of the skills that they were valued for have dropped down. So typically, let us say many years ago, just to take an example that probably doesn't hurt anybody, many years ago, the bank started computerizing. And you had a lot of employees who were very good, who were very committed to the bank, 15 years, 20 years, etc., etc., but they weren't really very conversant with how to manage the computers, right? And from that perspective, therefore, the competence was probably, there was understanding of the subject was there. Exactly how it needed to be done in the new way of doing things was probably not there. At the same time, the commitment is fairly high. I'll give you a very simple example from just a week ago. There's a post office near my house, and when I go to do my speed post, the guy has traditionally taken it, he puts something into the system, and he generates a receipt and sticks it, and we say thank you and move on. About a week to 2 weeks back, the line was much longer. So when I got to the front, I said, what's the matter? Are there more people here today? He said, no, there are not more people here today, same as normal. It's just that I am taking much longer to process each person. And the reason for that is we have a new system. And we have a new system, so I need to put X in and I need to put Y in, and still need to figure out what goes where, etc., etc. And very interestingly, and this is a post office guys, and we all tend to say that, all right, what's their level of commitment, and isn't it a guaranteed job and all. But I was very interested to hear what this guy said, because I sympathized, empathized with him and said, oh, that's tough on you. He turns around and say, yes, it is tough on me, but that's going to be tough today, tomorrow, day after, and next week. After that, this new system is going to make me fly. And why? Because otherwise, every time you come, I have to enter your details every time in the system. Now the system is going to save your details. I just can, from a drop down menu, pick you out, or I enter the first 3 letters of your name, and your name will pop up. I don't need to re-enter a lot of the things. He also went on to say that many of these parties that you actually correspond with, again, those addresses will also get picked up automatically. So yes, I have a problem today, tomorrow, day after, next week, but see me after 3 weeks and you'll see this line is non-existent because I'm processing them so fast. That's very interesting. And the style that his supervisor needs to adopt there is, how can he get comfortable with this new computer system much faster? Because commitment is not in doubt, it's the question of getting more competent. And as the guy gets more competent, then presumably he will be an even more valuable employee. When you look at the participating part, which is all about the high competence, the commitment may be good, the commitment may be a little low. And the question people often ask is, why is that the case? Should it not be the case that when his competence gets high, his commitment also necessarily gets high? The answer is yes and no. It works on occasion, and there are occasions where clearly it does not work, right? And the reason it actually does not work is primarily because that's around the time people are getting a little more, let's say, overconfident or ahead of themselves. They are beginning to think that they're really, really good and other people don't matter. So probably you will see that they will think highly of their own capabilities, and they're probably right. But put them into a group to work with 2 or 3 others, and you will find that there will always be some amount of flashpoint, some amount of friction, etc., etc. So what do you actually do with those sort of people? You build up their commitment. You are less directive, because this is around the time when they're beginning to think of themselves as experts and would probably not very much appreciate your coming in and telling them a lot of new expertise. You'll do a little bit of it, but not a very large part of it. But essentially what you will do is you will build up their self-esteem, you will reassure them, you will listen to them, you will make them, as I said before, self-reliant, and that is particularly important, and you'll teach them the value of collaborating. In effect, what are you doing? You're preparing them for the next stage of when they show both high commitment and high competence, and you can actually let go to a fair extent and allow them to actually do a lot of the stuff themselves, right? So that becomes something of, what do you do when you're faced with these different situations? Like I said before, there's no right or wrong, there's no good or bad. You basically adopt these different styles. Essentially, there's a lot of stuff that's available on situational leadership, and I'm saying this as I come to the end of my slides. There's a hell of a lot of terabytes available on the treasure on the internet. There are many good self-assessments which you can use to actually say, hey, what is my style? Uh, uh, and when you say, hey, what is my style as a situational leader, what you're really imagining or trying to get at is to say, which style do I use more often? But look at any of these leadership styles like the wheels of a car. If you cast your mind back, maybe some of you have seen an image of a monocycle, right? One large wheel, and you're basically supposed to balance on that. Pretty unstable. You look at a bicycle, which has two wheels, a little better than a motorcycle, but still not very stable. You look at then a three-wheeler, much better than a bicycle and of course a motorcycle, but there's something which is even better, which is a four-wheeler, which is a motor car, which has four wheels and is therefore more stable. So look at it from that perspective, that when you do any of these quizzes, and I put a link up there of a pretty nice quiz. It's obviously not mine, it's not Univibes, it's a different third party, but it's a very nice link. It's also free and it'll also give you a good perspective on yourself. You'll probably find that you will be seen as, okay, I'm a good tell and I'm fairly strong in coach, but the other two are weak. Don't be happy with that. What you really need to look at is to say, okay, my primary style may be to tell, but I need to develop all of the other three at least as a secondary style so that I am much stronger, right? And that becomes something for all of us to really, really work on. Let me give you a couple of instances where, let us say, situation leadership cannot be used in total. So it's like a crisis. So God forbid, let's say there is a fire in the building, and people are trapped inside. For then you to get into a delegative mode or a participative mode or a coaching mode doesn't work. You can't then say, all right, guys, why don't you call a meeting on Monday and ensure that we book the conference room and maybe we'll have pizza for lunch. You can't do that, right? Because the building's burning now. So you would be directive. They would be telling, happening. There would be roles being assigned to different people to deliver and deliver now. However, if you already have a prior understanding of the team members and the co-workers, then this assignment of roles becomes that much easier, right? And so there is still a way in which it can actually be applied back. Now, I've spoken for a long time. Maybe it's a good idea to get you guys to also maybe think a little bit and maybe reflect. So reflect on your co-workers. You have A, B, C, D, E, F. Where would each individual stand on the competence commitment grid? And I think this will also answer the question of the person who said, is this a team competence, right? So meaning, are we measuring competence as a team, not just what is necessary for the whole team? So just take a moment. You have a couple of guys, they may not report to you, but you, let's say, work with them day in and day out. Where do they stand on this competence commitment grid? Are you treating all of them just the same? Do you delegate to everybody regardless of the fact that their requirement may be to be given instructions? Do you attempt to coach everyone regardless of the fact that maybe they are beyond it and they are people with a lot of initiative and drive? And therefore, are there opportunities for you to improve the team performance by applying some of what we've learned today? What I will do is I'll leave the slide up for a minute. I'd ask each of you to just reflect. And maybe if you have any thoughts or comments, please put them into the chat box so that Shrey can pick them up. We can look at them and we can actually get a sense of where you are going. So 1 minute reflection time for each of you on this webinar. Shrey, as you start getting the answers, maybe you can start reading out some parts of it. We don't need to know who said what. We're just interested in what is said.
Sure.
So I'm seeing a couple of things coming up which are basically about my team is small and everybody is new. Okay, good luck to you. Uh, but at the same time, if everybody is new, it's also a great opportunity for you to groom them the way you want to groom them and move them on through the stages, through the telling, into the coaching, from the coaching into the participating, and from the participating into the delegating stage at a fairly fast clip. That is something which I think is worth doing. You might also like to find that maybe you don't need to do each of the bits of the directive. Maybe the team can even learn from each other. So as somebody does some small bit of it fairly well, that person can become the mentor or the tutor for his or her co-workers. So that is again a way in which you can go about and doing it. There's something in the chat box about um, team members who are significantly older than me, and therefore in what way do I actually handle them, and what style do I typically look. That's an interesting one. So team members who are older than you uh, probably could be divided into, unfortunately, all of the four boxes. So like I gave you the bank or the post office example, there may be new ways of working, and therefore they find that they are not very competent in that, although they understand the business, they understand the company very well, and maybe there is a little bit of directive style that you have to adopt there. But at the same time, with these people, although the telling is about low supportive and high directive, like I said, sometimes you have to adapt even within the style. And what you will have to do is ensure that at all times these people feel wanted, and they don't feel that the young upstart leader who has come along, the young upstart manager who has come along, is now riding roughshod over them. There has to be a respect for both their commitment to the company as well as the fact that they probably, in terms of systems, or not so much systems, maybe processes and how the company works, that they have a fair amount of advantage and they have a fair amount of knowledge. So that is something which I would certainly urge, that with experienced employees, you might like to look at the fact that you will actually keep their self-esteem high, while sometimes you will need to be probably a little directive, you need to probably spend a little more time. They could also very quickly move into a co-creation sort of mode, where maybe there are some, could be some elements because of the newness and so on, where there is a level of direction that you provide, but they are aware of the processes, they are aware of how the company works, and therefore they are able to pick that up and apply that very quickly. Again, ensure that the relationship part of what you do as a leader, the supportive part, in no way endangers their self-esteem, and they must be seen as, both by others, by you, as well as by themselves, as being valuable members. And when you are able to get that going, I think it becomes only a hop, step, and jump away in terms of being able to delegate. Again, with the delegate, you will probably find with these very old team members that there'll be a fair amount of supportiveness, like I already touched upon, in terms of ensuring their levels of self-esteem, etc., which you will have to do. You'll probably have to address them slightly differently from how you work with the rest of the team. In fact, a very funny example as I talk about that, I remember one of my early jobs. My team was had a couple of members who were pretty old, and I talked to everybody as boys and girls, or I addressed them as chaps. And on the second or third day, these two guys, who are the more senior guys, take me aside and say, we are not boys and girls, we are not chaps. Can you please call us by our name? And I realized what I had not meant with any lack of respect was actually being perceived as flippancy or a lack of respect, or actually disrespect. And that was not my plan. But at the end of the day, like I have learned to say now, there's no such thing as you misunderstood. It's all about my miscommunicating. And from that day, I realized that what I say is not very important in terms of that I said it. It's more important what did the other guy pick up. And as leaders, that's something we have to do day in and day out. Yeah, it's not enough to say I meant it this way, or they misunderstood. Not good enough, chum. As a leader, you have to be very clear that they understand and pick up exactly what you wanted them to understand. Let me move on then, and the slide just before I say thank you. Uh, Reflect a little bit about yourself. How are you perceived? If you believe that your manager micromanages you, your leader micromanages you, what's he actually doing? He's saying probably you need this level of direction, you need this level of supervision. He's impinging as you see it on your autonomy, but from his perspective, he's saying this person needs it. Is that because you are giving him or her some cues? Is your quality of your work great? Have you ensured that you are at the cutting edge of your profession? Do you know all the latest things that are happening in your business? Or maybe there is something that he's beginning to pick up in terms of commitment. And maybe he's beginning to think that you're spending too much time uh, on your social life. I don't know. At the end of the day, there has to be a balance. You have to also manage the perception of the other person, because that is reality for the other person, right? But it's a good question to ask ourselves: what cues are we giving our managers that causes them to handle us in this way? So I may think I'm extremely good in terms of my job, but if I actually discover that my manager is coaching me in terms of coaching, as used in the situation leadership sense, coaching me in terms of learning new things about my job, improving my domain knowledge, so to say, then clearly the manager has picked up that my domain knowledge is not good enough. And that's a question mark on my competence. So reflect a little bit, please. Take half a moment. What can you change starting today? Yeah, if you have any thoughts, put it in the chat box. We'll be happy to pick it up. But otherwise, even if you just take it away and reflect on it, I think this hour will be worth your time. So, to summarize, you see that picture there. It's called a quiver, and there are arrows in it. So, a quiver is basically a holder for the arrows. In case some of you don't like the analogy of arrows because it conjures up fighting and distasteful things, think of it as a set of golf clubs. So whether it is an arrow or a golf club, the leader pulls out the right arrow or the right golf club for the right job. So the Africans, the original guys who actually were very good at bows and arrows, the pygmies and so on, had a different type of arrow for each animal. And depending on which animal they were hunting, they would actually pull out that arrow. Similarly, if you play golf, then you use a wood for certain shots, you use an iron for certain shots. Even between the iron, you have different irons that you might use and different woods that you might use and a different putter that you might use. So, as a leader, you will need to develop these multiple styles so that you are much more adaptive and therefore far more effective. And what we've talked about today is one such effective tool. Go back a little bit in terms of our mythology also, and you will find that even the deities that we revere, the Mahapurush, so to say, the big leaders that we revere, have also sometimes been larger than life, sometimes they've been mighty, sometimes they have been conciliatory, sometimes they have been supportive, sometimes they have been tough, sometimes they have been extremely uplifting of the whole team. And at different points in time, depending on the situation, depending on who they are working with, they've adapted these different styles. So if you as leaders can pick up multiple styles, that's something that's going to serve you in very good state. Thank you very much for being on this webinar. We still have about 2 minutes left. So if there are any questions, Shrey, you can pick them up and ask them, and we can take them forward. Otherwise, as we come to the top of the hour, we are happy to let everybody go back and be very good leaders. Over to you, Shrey.
So there are a few questions. The first one is why do we challenge in the delegating part of the quadrant, and what if the team member does not like challenging?
Excellent question. Thank you so much. Why do we challenge? We challenge so that we are continually at the cutting edge. We challenge so that the other person gets a chance to also educate the rest of us by taking us through his or her thinking. We challenge because there may be some areas that the other person may not have completely considered, even though they are pretty competent. We challenge because there may be evidence from other areas. So essentially what happens, and if you look at it from the perspective of even sport, the real champions are bred when there is real competition, right? For many years, for those of you who followed Formula One, Michael Schumacher reigned the tracks. And the whole idea was that, nobody else is really coming up. That's one side, but they were actually coming up. But the question was, is Michael Schumacher getting necessarily better because he's not being challenged? And the whole answer is that's one of the reasons we challenge, so that we can keeping the thought current, and we can ensure that the quality of the thought is absolutely perfect. Yes, Ray, what's the next question?
Yeah, sir. The next question is, in a startup environment, if you
Ah,
think that the leader, hello?
yes, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. In a startup environment, if you think that the leader, the top level CXO itself is low in competence and appears false on promises, which quadrant should I be in, as in the person who's asking the question, to deal with such a person?
Okay, so you've turned the situational leadership on its head, which is an interesting one. Yep, absolutely, absolutely fair. All right. There are then two things that clearly you need to develop. Which quadrant should you be in, and what should you do? Because we are not necessarily here talking of the leader, but what you should be working on is ensuring you are really, really competent, and doing that in not a very threatening manner. So you might like to not just state a proposition and say, you're supposed to know it, but actually offer backup. You actually offer proof. You offer others' opinions which support what you're saying. So competence becomes extremely important in the light of your question. The other one is, clearly you need to get the other person to start trusting you a little more, and therefore from that perspective you need to display a level of commitment. Yeah, so that commitment and competence, those are the two things which, both if they are high, are actually good. And in this case you probably need to clearly state in a non-threatening way your capabilities, and ensure that you are able to communicate that you are indeed at the cutting edge. Yes, Ray.
I think we'll take a couple of more questions, sir. I know the time is a little extended, but I think we have a lot of questions, so let's answer two more.
Okay, sure.
Okay. So, in an organization where many people have been working for several years, and the challenge that is being faced is that competencies have not evolved over this period of time. People are high on commitment, okay, but the competence is not there. They're not inexperienced, but it's a matter of willingness to adapt. So, in this kind of situation, how do you lead the team?
Okay, all right. That's, I think, a very, very interesting question. And essentially what you're saying is, this is a high commitment team, but probably their capabilities, their competence is on the lower side. Right. In this sort of a case, you need to address it from a perspective of ensuring that the competence is raised at the fastest. How do you do this? As a leader, and like I said, there are many different styles that you use. You understand what comes out of from the situational leadership, but essentially you lead by example, right? And you then get the team to start thinking that these are the new areas that I need to develop on. So, for example, let us say digital marketing becomes an area where there may be people who are very committed, but as you know, digital marketing is probably evolving almost day in and day out. Gone are the days when you maybe looked at how many carts were abandoned and why they were abandoned. You have now gone far beyond. So essentially, you lead by example, by picking up and saying that, look, these are the couple of things that we as a team need to learn. Second, what might actually work in this sort of situation that you've described is, you ensure that there's a little bit of anonymity. So you won't necessarily say, Mr. X, will you work on this? You might put together a group of X and Y and Z and say, hey, will you three guys work on this? And therefore there is one can support the other, and nobody has to look in that sense foolish. The third part about it, dwelling on the point foolish, is it's up to you as the leader to ensure that nobody looks foolish. And that is something that you have to drive, to say that, if we are not understanding something, it's up to us to learn. Now, what also happens, and which we have to be careful of, is in organizations where people have been around for a long time, their loyalties are a little more to the organization than to you as a leader. And that then becomes the point where you have to basically start saying that these are the new ways of working. This is what we will need to learn. This is what we need to get capable of. Whether it's fortunate or unfortunate, sometimes teams don't always get the message, and sometimes bringing in a little bit of fresh blood also works wonders, because then everybody is driven by the new capabilities that have come in. Yes, Shrek?
Yeah, sir. So that's we can come to the last question. The question states that how do I seamlessly move across these four quadrants? Are there any tips or tricks for that? And does my personality become an impediment to do this?
That is a truly remarkable question, and let me attempt to answer it, because I think we'll probably need another 45 minutes to be able to get to the root of it. But it's a really very good question. Unfortunately, one of the presumptions of your question are right. Very often we let our personality come in the way of seamlessly transiting between these, because we say, this is my style. I used to have a boss who used to say, I am a tough as nails guy. And he worked doubly hard to ensure that he was perceived as being tough as nails, even in situations that needed him to be significantly more supportive. And you can imagine, therefore, teams therefore didn't actually gel very well, or people didn't want to work very hard with him. It is now up to us to say that, I wasn't born with this style. I wasn't born as a tough as nails guy. I wasn't born as a people's guy, etc., etc. It is a set of experiences that has molded me to believe that this is now my style. Fair, I'm successful, I got here. But at the same time, I am now faced with a different situation. And therefore, in the same way as I got here, by molding myself, I need to be open to not let my perception of my own style come in the way, because I wasn't born with it. I actually evolved into this situation. And there's a very nice book by a guy called Marshall Goldsmith, who's the world's #1 and the most leading coach, and he coaches all the big wigs. He's written a book which says, what got you here won't get you there. And basically he says, you got to here with a set of characteristics, behaviors, and so on, but don't blindly assume that the same characteristics will get you to the next higher levels. There may be some adaptations and changes that you clearly have to do. So that's the first part, in terms of not letting my perceptions get in the way of my adapting my style. The second bit about it, in terms of how do I seamlessly move from one to the other. Excellent question, like I said. Let me give you a very simple answer, because I've found that it works for me, but unfortunately it's a tough one to work on. And that is to never have a bias in my mind. Unfortunately, as leaders, we all have some set of biases. So we say, X works very hard, but I don't think he's quite bright. Or we say, Y has all the right characteristics, if only he or she was more committed. So we've already made in our mind a mental picture of the person. And what prevents me from seamlessly moving from one style to the other is that I carry this bias in. And even if the question is asked because it is a good question, because it's a genuine question, if I believe that person is not really pushing himself or herself to get more capable, improve competence, then I will bring that bias in, and my response may well be more in the, as if I have delegated, whereas that person is actually looking for some value add for me to add, some instruction to get, a little bit of direction to get. It could be this, it could be any other, right? And therefore, the whole part about it is I treat each question as one more step in the journey towards making our team even stronger and delivering even more sustainable results. And that is something, if we are able to look at, never easy. Maybe the way you do it is you prepare for it. You know you're going to have a chat with X. Your belief about X is bright guy but lazy. Park that at the door when you go in for the discussion, right? And maybe you put a little slip in front of yourself, which he doesn't see, but you put it yourself in front of your laptop so the screen is up, and maybe it's just got a right written on it saying, "Am I biased?" and with a big question mark, so that you constantly remind yourself that you're not bringing any of these biases into a natural, seamless moving from one style to the other. The other bit which I think is relevant for me to touch upon, because you have talked about it, is we need to understand that people evolve. In most of our cases, we believe that this is the same person we are dealing with who joined us 5 years ago. But that person has attained new capabilities, has got to start working with the team, has got different aspirations. But if I as a leader fail to appreciate that, then typically the commitment and the morale of this person will keep on dropping. So be open also to the fact that people may actually get significantly better. And occasionally, I guess there will be occasions when they will actually slip back. So somebody whom you delegated very effectively for some period of time is now looking like he needs some more direction or whatever it is. And then you need to also, as a leader, investigate what happened. Yes, Ray?
Thank you so much. I think we have overshot by 10, 12 minutes. So, although there were a lot more questions, I think if the participants can write into the email ID mentioned on the screen, then we would be happy to answer them over email, right? So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you
so
write in, we will give you an answer as early as possible.
great.
And thank you
So,
very much from my side too.
yes, thank you, Srinivas sir, for that wonderful webinar. And I'm sure the audience has gained great insights on their leadership styles and how and when they can, manage that. Many thanks to all of you for being attentive and for those wonderful questions which have enriched this webinar for everyone. We have a very detailed and intensive program on managerial and leadership effectiveness, which is tailored for organizations as a whole. If you think we can connect to your organization's L&D manager for discussing this in more detail, there's a small form at the end of the webinar which you can fill in. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. And there's also a feedback at the end which will help us improve our webinars and meet your expectations. Have a great day and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.